assignment 1 tomorrow morning. What I'll do is I'll just send a blast email to the class letting you know I've emailed them and then individually send them out to you. If you don't get it after the blast email, let me know. I don't think there should be a problem, but I've told you I've had difficulties in the past. I am posting some questions on assignment 2 on the front of the website, the home page. Basically, they're your questions that several of you have emailed to me that I thought might be sources of confusion for others. So you can see I've got assignment 2 questions in the category for assignment questions. So you might want to take a look at those before you submit your assignment, just to make sure you understand everything. I haven't put every question that everybody sent to me. So basically, I'm guessing as to what might be confusing to you. And do keep the questions coming, as I keep on saying. I keep on telling you to come ask me questions. I mean it. And so far, they've all been good ones. Okay, so as advertised, we have an exciting class today in legislative history. And the reason it's so exciting, I think, is it's one of the more difficult areas. At least some people think it's more difficult. I don't want to scare you off. I've even had librarians tell me that they're still not a little confident with legislative history. So to that end, we have Isaac again here to help us with our workshop, which won't be until the end of class, so he has very generously donated his time to sit through the entire class so he can make sure he can help answer any questions we have on the workshop.
For the record, totally confident. Don't know what she's talking about.
Okay, so if legislative history is so challenging, why are we bothering? Why do you care? It's not something you will run into very frequently or much at all. Some of you in your entire careers may not run into it at all. But there are a couple of answers why I spend as much time as I do in class on that. One of which is, honestly, as I meet with librarian colleagues in the area, and these are law firm colleagues, so these are librarians working with attorneys, they lament the fact that new associates come in and don't understand the legislative process, don't understand the basic of legislative history. They don't expect you to know all the details and nuts and bolts, but just a general understanding. So that's the main reason I keep it in. The reason you would need to do legislative history research, there are actually 2, in my opinion. First is determining legislative intent. So you've been reading statute sections. We did it in class. You're doing it now for your assignment. And sometimes the question is going to come up, what did the legislature mean by this particular language? What was their intent in passing this particular section or this entire act? And sometimes an entire case or controversy can revolve around that very question. And an example of that is this Chase Scientific Research case. It's a New York Court of Appeals case of the highest court of New York back in 2001, basically looking at a statute of limitations question. And what I've done is just scroll down and highlighted the language, and I know you may or may not be able to see the details, but basically the court, in its decision, is saying that 1962, the legislature replaced 2-year limitation contained in a particular section. Revisers noted that statute, leaving in response to a perceived healthcare crisis, the legislature shortened the statute of limitation. So the court, in its decision, is looking at what the legislature did back in 1962, and then if you scroll down a little, you'll see it continues on. Most recently, in response to Sears case and its progeny, the legislature amended this particular section to clarify limitations period. So the court in detail is reviewing the legislative history, and it ultimately makes its decision based on its analysis of that legislative history. I like to think, I don't know this for a fact, I haven't asked anybody, but I like to think that the attorneys on the winning side of this case had a very enterprising young associate who got assigned, go look at the legislative history. This young associate knew how to do his or her research, and she found this legislative history on this particular statute of limitations section and wrote out her memo on it and presented it to the partner who argued the case, and lo and behold, they won the case because they understood the legislative history. Will this happen to you? Maybe. Will it happen to you often? Probably not, but it's possible. And as I've said, colleagues consider it important enough to urge those of us in the academic world to please have students have a better understanding. So here I am. So that legislative intent, the first reason why you might need to do legislative history research. Second reason, far less frequent, bill tracking. So we looked at some proposed legislation when we were looking at whether or not our resource was up to date, and we saw the little yellow flag saying proposed legislation. So we knew, okay, a bill's been introduced, but nothing's happened yet. We don't have to worry about it. But you might want to know what's happening with that proposed legislation. If this is the area you practice in, day out, you might want to know what's going on in the legislature. How far has this bill gotten? Do I need to keep my eye open? Could the law change? Or is this something they do every year and I don't need to worry about it? Or maybe this year I do need to worry about it. So you want to track that bill or see what its status is. So having talked about doing legislative intent research and having this court focus its opinion on the legislative intent for that particular section, I should also note in all fairness that not all judges think that legislative history or legislative intent arguments are valid. In fact, here is an example of Justice Scalia, who famously did not believe that legislative intent arguments were valid. And he used to have, in fact, I think somewhere there's a debate in an article between Justice Scalia and Justice Breyer. Justice Breyer does believe legislative intent arguments are valid. So you may or may not be before a judge who agrees with Justice Scalia or Justice Breyer. But you can see Justice Scalia's opinion is the greatest defect of legislative history is its illegitimacy. So you could read on if you're interested as to why he thinks that. But just as give you a heads up that this is not a always considered legitimate argument. There may be some judges out there who don't buy it as similar to Justice Scalia. Okay, so what I have tried to do is, since it is somewhat involved, is I've tried to break it down in this handout, Key to Legislative History Research, and try to break it out for you into 4 steps. We'll go through each step in depth, but if you can master these 4 steps or come pretty close, you will have a good understanding of legislative history research. Everybody have handouts? Do you have both? Okay, actually, why don't we just pass these around and take if you need, or keep on passing if you already have. And this handout, by the way, should you lose a piece of paper, I can of course give you another. It's also in our handouts link on the course website. Okay, so the first step, as you can see, is we need to understand the legislative process. As you may recall, back when we talked about statutes, we talked about our hero, the public law. And we went over, or actually we didn't go over, I just said a public law starts as a bill, and then there's this whole process until it becomes a public law. What we're going to discuss is this whole process between our friend, this little bill here, and our black arrow. So really what we're doing today is talking about that black arrow. So we started with our public law, as I said, in our, like in Star Wars, in parts 4 through 6 of our story. So now we're finally getting back to start in the very beginning, or even our prequel of parts 1 through 3. So what better way to do that than to have that story told by a cartoon, right? Okay. I have to press play first. Bear with me while I get the technology straight.
Whew, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee. But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." And he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will. But today I'm still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. I hope and pray that he will. But today I'm still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so old.
By that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but now I hope and pray that I will. But today I'm still just a bill. He signed your bill. Now you're a law. Oh, yeah.
It's meant to be fun. So what we are going to do now is to take a closer look at the legislative process and out at part 2 of our 4-step process, which is understanding the documents produced. And actually our little cartoon, our little bill actually mentioned a lot of those documents or referred to them really in passing. Okay, and also part of the key is, I think is true for any legal research and just understanding the law generally, is understanding the abbreviations, because part of the time just knowing what you're looking at is understanding what the abbreviation is. We'll go over that as well, and also I will point out on the last page of the legislative history handout is a listing of those abbreviations. So you can pull this out and refer back to it if that works for you. Okay, so as we saw when we talked about statutes, Congress is organized and assigned a number every 2 years because the House of Representatives sits for 2 years. We're currently in the 115th Congress, which started last month. 114th Congress was 2015 to 2016, and this is a chart that we saw before. This is relevant not only for statutes, but for legislative history research, because that Congress number is going to apply for the documents that get produced over the course of a bill, making it into becoming a law. So you'll want to understand, again, what that number is. Okay, so let's take a look at page 2 of our handout. And the other thing, we're going to go almost trimodal here, is I have another walkthrough where I have a bunch of pages so we can take a very close look at what some of these documents look like, so hopefully get a better understanding. So on page 1, if cartoons are not your thing, although I can't understand how that could be for anybody, but anyway, if cartoons are not your thing, you see more of a pictorial representation of how a bill becomes a law. Honestly, all of those circles can be a little confusing, at least I find them so, but if it works for you, great. And on page 2 of the walkthrough handout, you will see the different names of the versions of a bill. I don't worry about these too much because for legislative history research, most of the time you're looking at the final version of the bill, but in case any of you are curious or you run into these names, here's one place to look them up. Of course, you can just Google it, which is sometimes what I wind up doing. But let's look at what we are more interested in, and that is the bill itself. We have our little picture of our little friend, the bill, and here's what it looks like in words on page 3. And probably one of the most important things you can remember about a bill is its abbreviation. So you'll see on page 3, I'm giving you an example of a bill from the 107th Congress, and its abbreviation is HR, and its number is 2563. And HR, when you see that abbreviation, that means it's a bill. A lot of people, because it says HR, they think it means House Report. And honestly, that's a very good guess. It's just not the right one. So you want to remember when you see HR in a number, it's a bill, and you want to look for the year or the Congress number to find out what year of Congress it's from. And the 2563 is just the 2,563rd bill introduced in the House of Representatives. So again, the following number isn't so significant. The first number, if it's the Congress number or the year, is. And you can see our particular bill from the 107th Congress happens to be one to amend ERISA, our good friend ERISA from 1974. And turning to page 2, you see what the bill looks like. And it actually kind of looks like our public law when we were looking at that for statutes, because essentially that's what a public law starts out as a bill. So that's how it's drafted with its table of contents and titles if it's going to be that involved. Any questions about bills? I should mention a bill that's introduced in the Senate. The abbreviation is just S, less confusing. But if you see S in a number, then that's a Senate bill. Okay, let's move on. So if you remember in our cartoon, our bill gets dragged off into a room with a door with a lot of people shouting, and that a bill gets referred to committee, or really probably the subcommittee. So you can see on page 5, we're looking at a hearing on the Subcommittee on Health of the Committee on Ways and Means. So our bill got referred to the Subcommittee on Health, and hearings are held. Basically, people, experts, or just interested people are invited in to tell the subcommittee why they think this bill is a great idea, or why they think it's a crummy idea, or whatever else they might want to share with the subcommittee. And so, as a consequence, what a hearing will look like, if you turn to page 6, is a hearing will have witnesses. So these are people who are actually going to the room in Congress where everybody is yelling and giving their thoughts orally. You can also have submissions for the record. You can have written testimony. So basically somebody can't make it all the way to Washington, D.C. or whatever reason. They send in their thoughts and it becomes part of the hearing record. So turning to page 7, you can see what the oral part of the hearing looks like. And these obviously get published. So the oral testimony looks kind of like a play, right? You have Mr. Stark, thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. And so you see the names of people and then what it is they say. Also, as the published part of the hearing, you will also find that those written submissions as well, as we saw in our table of contents. Hearings are cited to in terms of abbreviation in a whole variety. There's no real standard way, so you can see on the last page, well, on page 2 of our key handout, you'll see SHRG or HHRG. Sometimes you won't see any abbreviation, you'll just see the whole name. Hearing in front of the Subcommittee on Health for the Committee of Ways and Means, it just gives you the whole long title. Sometimes, as we see actually back on page 5, it's called a serial. So hearings are kind of all over the map in terms of how they're referred to. Turning the page to page 6, sometimes, infrequently, and it wasn't even mentioned in our cartoon, there will be something called a committee print. Basically, the committee or the subcommittee says, this area is really super technical. We need some expert analysis, some people who are really super technical and educated in this area to help us make sense of this really super technical area. So an example might be tax, right? Tax is a whole lot of numbers and percentages and calculations, or very scientific areas. I would think maybe patent, possibly the environment. The subcommittees or committees might ask for expert analysis, and that would appear as a committee print. And you can see an example of that on page 8, abbreviated, in this case for the Senate, SPRT. And again, notice the number 107. That's telling me 107th Congress. And then the -30 is just the 30th print. You won't see these too much, but once in a while you will. And you can see what a print looks like. An example of technical analysis on page 9, this committee print. This is an IRS print, or a print rather, excuse me, regarding the Internal Revenue Code, not the Internal Revenue Service. And you can see all the numbers and the analysis having to do with income rates. So prints you won't see too much and are less use with regard to legislative intent research. But now turn the page to page 10, and this is the opposite. We are now looking at an actual committee report. And committee reports, for my money, and there may be people who disagree, librarians or other researchers who disagree with me, but for my money, committee reports are the first place to go if you're doing legislative intent research. So put that in your notes, star, capital letters, red letters, however you do it. Look to committee report for legislative intent. The reason for that is, as you remember, our hero, the bill, got thrown into the committee room. They had all the argument, and then, if you remember, they said, and if they vote yes, they report. If the committee votes yes on the bill, they report favorably. And when the committee reports favorably, it issues a report. And it's issuing a report saying basically why they're reporting favorably, why they think this bill is such a good idea, right? Legislative intent. Why did the committee, who looked at this in depth and held hearings and heard experts, why did they decide ultimately to vote and say, yes, we think this should continue on the process, this bill? And that is what appears in the report. So let's take a closer look at the report. First, let's notice the number. So there's a report, and it's number 93. Again, it's the 93rd Congress, and -533. And that's 533. That's the report number. The report, the numbers, the Congress numbers are significant. So 93 is always going to be 93rd Congress. The first number is going to be the Congress. But the second number, 533, doesn't relate to the bill number. It doesn't relate to the public law number. If it ultimately becomes a public law number, it's just a number in sequence. So don't get confused. So here is our report. And this is, again, if it's a House report, then it's going to be abbreviated. There's several different ways. HRPT, HREP. Sometimes it's just spelled out, H report or House report, but not HR. HR, remember, is a bill. So looking at this report, you can see a synopsis. So this is a House report produced back again in the 93rd Congress. So this report was actually produced in consideration of what ultimately became ERISA. And so this report gives us a synopsis, an overview of why the committee thinks ERISA is a good idea overall. Turning the page, what you will find, page 11 of the walkthrough, what you will frequently find in reports, and this is one of the reasons why I say best source for legislative intent, or one of the best sources, is you will frequently, not always, but frequently find a section of the report called section by section analysis. And it's what it sounds like. The committee goes through each section of the bill and tells you why it thinks it should be the way they've drafted it, or what Congress intended in each section, as it says on the handout. You will also, maybe in the section by section analysis, maybe earlier on in the report, get an overview of the legislation itself. So we have purposes in the beginning of the section by section analysis in this report. So it's telling us the Employee Benefit Security Act is designed to establish minimum standards, etc. So it's giving us why Congress is passing ERISA overall, its purposes. And then if you turn the page 12, as promised and advertised, the section by section analysis, the committee report is telling us, starting with the very first section, what the section is supposed to do, what the intent is. So section 101, coverage. Section 102, duty of disclosure. Turning to page 12A of the walkthrough handout, we see, remember section 514, that's our preemption section. As we discovered when we were looking through, talking about statutes, so section 514 doesn't really say very much. All state laws would be preempted except for those covering plans not subject to Titles 2 or 3. So it's not really giving us much of intent, which unfortunately can frequently be the case when you're doing legislative intent. You may have a question and think, oh my goodness, they had to have talked about this. Well, 30, 40 years ago, maybe they didn't really think about that and didn't talk about it. Or maybe 2 years ago when they passed the legislation, they just didn't talk about it. Probably more frequently than not, you won't get exact discussion in any of your legislative intent research that says exactly what it is you're looking for. But you still need to look like our enterprising associate did in the Chase Scientific research, because there may be discussion in your area generally that you can then argue, well, they said this, so they really meant to do this. Or sometimes I've seen arguments where they didn't say anything about this, so obviously they didn't want to do it. So even when you don't find something, there are legislative intent arguments to be made. Okay, any question? Yeah.
Why would a public law be mentioned in historical statutory notes, but not in the parenthetical? Because if it affected, the section in some way, is therefore included in the notes, why would it not be parenthetical?
You're way ahead of us, which is good, but we will get into the parenthetical and the historical and statutory notes to answer your question. Probably in the parenthetical, that's a public law that somehow amended the section. It might have only been a technical amendment, so maybe they don't mention it in the historical statutory notes. Or if it is, are you saying mention in the historical statutory notes and not in the parenthetical?
Yeah, exactly.
It could be a public law that didn't have direct effect on that particular section, but was mentioned elsewhere in, sometimes certain sections of the code mention other sections of the code, so they could be referring to that public law from that other section of the code. And for those of you not familiar with historical and statutory notes, we'll be getting there a little bit later. Okay. Any other questions? Questions about reports or anything so far, or getting ahead of us so far? I'll see if I can bring that in also. Okay, so committee reports, one of the best sources for legislative intent. Again, don't get the abbreviation with House Bill confused. HR is House Bill, HRPT, REP is House Committee Report, and of course SRPT, SREP would be Senate. Okay. Let's dive into one of the more interesting publications for legislative history research, and that has to do with congressional debates. So remember, after our bill, our hero, got reported favorably in the committee, and they were, yes, got dragged to the Capitol, to the big building, and that's where the entire House debated that particular bill. So a bill starts in one chamber or the other. So for the moment, I'm assuming our bill, and I think it's true in that story, our bill started in the House of Representatives. A bill can start in the Senate too. So in the House of Representatives, gets referred to the subcommittee. If the subcommittee reports out favorably and votes yes, a report is issued and then gets debated in front of the entire House of Representatives, all 435 members if they're all there. Those are the debates of Congress, and you will find them in the congressional record. And I meant to write this on the board before I got to class. I had a bit of a delay. So, Congress debates. And I suggest you write this in your notes, equals. Congressional, I hope you write it more legibly than I do. You're all typing, so you will. Congress debates equals congressional record. Now, librarians like Isaac will point out to me, that's not quite right, Lisa, because congressional debates appear in other publications too. Don't worry about it. Those are older publications. As you can see on page 13, you can see the date range. The congressional record started in 1873. So as of 1873, that's a correct statement. So I think we can just say that overall and not worry about all the old stuff. If you're doing research before 1873, come talk to a librarian because it gets very involved. Okay, so remember, congressional debates. So debates in the entire chamber, either House or Senate, you will find in the congressional record. So I've said that at least 4 times now. I'll probably say at least 4 more. So what does the congressional record look like? Well, the congressional record is so much fun because it gets published in 2 versions, and it gets cited in 2 different versions, which makes it fun for you to find, either as source gatherers for a journal or as attorneys doing legislative history intent research. So let's start with the bound. So congressional record gets bound. And what, again, the debate, so the debate each day gets reported in the congressional record, and we'll see what that looks like in just a second, and it gets bound in the bound volume, and that's how it's referred to. And I will pass this around. Yeah, I know you do some weightlifting. So you can see the title page. Actually, what we're looking at isn't the exact volume that I'm passing around, but it's the same year, so it's close enough. So here is the congressional record for 1974 between February 26th and March 6th. And so it's telling us it's pages 4153 to 5628. And you'll see why those pages make a difference in just a second. So let's turn the page to page 15 of our handout. And here's what the congressional record looks like. It looks like the transcript of a debate or a play, as I like to say. So you can see on the left-hand column, Ms. Holtzman says a few things. In the middle column, Mr. Earlborn, if I'm saying that correctly, has a thing or 2 to say. In the right-hand column, Mr. O'Neill says some stuff. And notice we are looking at page 4724. So that's 4724 of the bound volume of February, whatever it is, 28, 1974. Before it gets put in the bound volume, however, as I mentioned, the congressional record is the record of the daily occurrences in either chamber, House, or Senate. So here is what the congressional record daily edition looks like. And this is the latest one we had in the library, January 17th, 2017. So pretty recently. It's a kind of a thin one. There are usually a bit more pages to them. Let's see if I'll start this one around for you. So let's look at page 16 of what the daily edition looks like. Now this is not 2017, this is from 2001, as you can see. So it's got August 2nd, 2001 to be precise. And we are looking at the House of Representatives pages. So what happened in the House of Representatives on August 2nd, 2001. And notice the page number on the bottom. That's H5179. A little on the small side, but it's there. The daily edition has different pagination than the bound edition, and that's how you tell the difference. And why do you care? Well, you care if you get a reference to the congressional record, you want to know which version to look at. Most likely, it'll be to the daily, I'm guessing. I've seen more references to the daily edition than to the bound edition. That's not to say you'll never see to the bound edition, but I can tell immediately by looking at the page number. If it's got a letter before it, it's the daily edition. If it doesn't have any letter, it's the bound edition. So we can see what happened on August 2nd, 2001 on page 16 of the handout. Let's turn the page. So more information about what happened that day on page H5214 of the daily edition. And we can see Mr. Solis talked about something, enacting Patient Bill of Rights. Turning to page 18, we see more of the day. So this is in the same edition, the daily edition, for August 2, and here are the Senate pages. So this is all one little pamphlet, and the little pamphlet going around, you'll actually see a couple of H pages, a few S pages. So you see the H pages, the House pages, the S pages, the Senate pages, and we see, so the Senate page for 2001, August 2nd, S8629 is where the Senate information starts. What happened in the Senate that day starts. Now, just a little side note, this really isn't going to be, I think, especially useful for legislative intent research, but there are also E-pages in the daily edition, and they get put in the bound, but they no longer have the letters, and the E-pages are extensions of remarks. So Congress people, both House and Senate, get to add in after the day is over if you ever, have a debate with someone or you do an oral argument and you think, like, after, darn it, I wish I said whatever. Well, if Congress people think that after the day or the next day, oh, I wish on the floor I said whatever, they get to add it, and it goes in the E-pages. You can see on the bottom, this bullet symbolizes statements or insertions which are not spoken by a member of the Senate, because we're looking at the Senate part of the floor. Matter in a particular typeface indicates words inserted or appended rather than spoken by a member of the House. So the typeface is if the House added it, I guess bullet is if the Senate adds it. They get to just add stuff. I don't know, if you're a political junkie, that might be interesting. If you don't care, then that's okay too. I think it's a fun fact. More relevant, however, are the D pages, the Daily Digest. Each daily edition of the Congressional Record has a digest. It's kind of like a abstract table of contents concept, where it tells you what happened that day in quick little summaries. For the thin little pamphlet that's going around now, that Jamie has now, probably not necessary. You can flip through real quick. But if you need to find something and you've got a 100-page congressional record, you don't want to have to go through 100 pages, the Daily Digest would be the way to find it. And that's a D page, not surprisingly. So we're looking at D page 833 on page 20 of our handout. Turning the page 21 of our handout, we've got page D 839, where the House of Representatives is summarized and abstracted. And in looking at the Daily Digest on page 22, if I were trying to figure out what happened with this particular measure, I would see on page 22, Norwood Amendment 2 printed in HREPT, remember report, guarantees patient federal remedies, and it's basically, this one actually is referring me to the next issue. So if I were interested in what Congress had to say on that issue, I'd have to go to the August 3rd Daily Edition, but at least I would know that looking at the Daily Edition. And you can see references to H pages above on page 22. Now that I'm going into a little bit of the weeds here on the Congressional Record, probably not something you will do very frequently because, again, if you think about it from a congressional intent, from a legislative intent standpoint, what a particular congressman or senator says isn't going to be dispositive of what Congress intended when they passed the entire legislation. But you may get references to this for whatever reason, so I'm going into a little bit more detail than is strictly necessary for legislative intent research. But moving on to page 23, what is necessary for legislative intent research, and nearly as important as the committee reports, are the conference reports. So remember, the process of our legislative process. Let's take a quick look back on page 2 of our Key to Legislative History Research handout. And I have an executive summary. Remember the process. It starts as a bill. Say the bill starts in the House of Representatives, gets referred to the subcommittee, they have hearings. If the committee agrees this is a good measure, they vote yes and they issue a committee report. The committee report, the bill then gets sent with the committee report to the full House of Representatives. That's where a bill started. They have their debates. Remember, congressional debates equals congressional records. We find the debates in the congressional record. Then if the House all votes yes, remember our bill, he got dragged all the way to the other House. Oh no, I have to start all over again. So he starts all over again in the Senate. Same thing starts again. Bill gets referred to the subcommittee in the Senate. They have hearings. If they vote positively, they may or may not issue a report. It goes to the full Senate. The full Senate, again, Congress debates it, the full Senate in the congressional record. if they vote yes, then it's very possible, not always, you have a House version, you have a Senate version, they might not be identical. Remember, they can only present one to the president, so if they're not identical, the House and the Senate have to meet to see if they can agree on an identical version. And that's called a conference committee. Basically, the leaders of the House and leaders of the Senate appoint a bunch of people, and the bunch of people meet and they see if they can hash out the language that's different so that they can have a single version. And if they accomplish it, if they agree on a single version, they will very likely issue a conference report. So that conference report will discuss those areas that were different. And they will discuss how they came to decide in those areas of the difference, what they decided to agree upon with regard to those differences. So that's why a conference report is also really useful for legislative intent, because if your language is areas that were disagreed upon in the House version and the Senate version, maybe they discussed why they adopted that particular language. So the bottom line is, if you're doing legislative intent research, look to the committee reports, look to the conference reports. So here's what a conference report looks like on page 23. So it tells us which bill was originally under consideration. Remember, bill abbreviation HR2 tells us it's a conference report. Turning on page 23A, we see a compare and contrast. We see in the first paragraph, the House bill requires annual reporting, the Senate bill requires submission of comparable financial, the conference substitute adopts the reporting format, so it's telling us what the conference did and which it decided to adopt. Actually, it looks like it adopted both in this particular case. But there you know, that's what Congress ultimately intended, looking at the differences in language from the House and Senate versions. And interestingly, as it turns out in this conference report, on page 23B, the conference report discusses preemption of state laws, section 514 of the bill. That's our section. And it talks about under the substitute provisions, Title I supersedes, and so there's a whole discussion. So if I am going to make a legislative intent argument for our client, I want to read this. Okay, any question about conference reports or really anything thus far in the legislative process and the documents produced? Okay, last but possibly least, maybe not least, is the president signing the bill. Remember, if I didn't close it, all my difficulties, our president signed our bill and our bill became law. And what president does when the president signs the bill is it's still he, issues a signing statement. And that appears in something called, well, it used to be called the Weekly Compilation of Presidential Documents. For a while it was called the Daily Compilation because it got put on the web. Now it's just called Compilation of Presidential Documents. So if you just remember that last part, compilation, you'll be good. And what a signing statement looks like on page 25. We can see the signing statement for ERISA, starting on the right-hand column. And the president may issue some statement about why he thinks it's a good idea. There was a while back in when George H.W. Bush was, no, I'm sorry, not George H.W., just George W. Bush. George W. Bush was president. There was a while where signing statements were somewhat controversial because there is a theory of executive power that suggests that a president can basically put in his theory of what the legislative intent should be. So under this unitary executive theory, and I'm not getting it exactly right, so don't quote me, but just to give you the general idea. Under this unitary executive theory, what a president would do is put in his version of what he thinks the legislative intent should be in the hopes of later on affecting legislative intent arguments, because he knows that lawyers make legislative intent arguments, so he wants to throw in his 2 cents. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes these statements are pretty bland, like, yeah, this is a great idea, I'll sign it. A little fancier than that, but along those lines. So you can see the presidential statement here on pages 25 and 26. Any questions about, and once it's signed, of course, as we saw with our picture, I have to pull it up one more time because it's fun, becomes a law. So here is our public law. President makes a signing statement. And voila, we are now moving from part 3 of our story into parts 4 through 6, which we already talked about with regard to statutes. Excuse me. Any questions? So if you understand the process and understand what those documents are that are produced, you are maybe 60% the way there to understanding how to do legislative history research. So I will take it. There are no questions. We're good so far. We'll talk about finding that all-important public law number, and then we will take a break and then actually dive in to talk about how to do legislative history research. And we kind of already know how to find the all-important public law number because we talked about it. And one of the reasons I went into public law numbers in such detail when we talked about statutes is that it really is the key to doing legislative history research. And the reason for that is that all of the resources that we look at are organized by public law numbers. Got that number, you're even further along the way in terms of doing legislative history research. So actually, it's a good opportunity because I'll dive in and talk a little bit about Joe's interesting question. So let's look at, let's not look at that one, let's look at our section. 29 USC 1144. I am guessing most of the time you're called on to do legislative history research or decide that you need to, is you are looking at a particular section in a code, the law as it is today, and you're thinking, what did Congress mean, or what did the state legislature mean by this language? We'll be talking about state legislative history research next week, but pretty much if you understand what we do today, you'll understand how to do it in the state as well. So we're wondering, what on earth did Congress mean about particular language, say maybe under Section A, under supersedure? What's this whole preemption thing? What did Congress have in mind? So what we need to find is the all-important public law number. And honestly, the way we do that is to go to the credits. And I'm just clicking on the link to get me down to the bottom of the page because I know that's where the credits are. If we take a look at our handout, we can see what it looks like in print. So on page 27, we look at our friendly U.S. Code annotated. We've already been here. And page 28 is the same page we looked at a couple of weeks ago, federal statutes, section 1144. And page 29, same page we looked at a couple of weeks ago, the parenthetical, also known as credits on Westlaw and history on Lexis. We'll look at Lexis in a little bit, but again, the concepts are the same. And this is how we get our public law number. So you'll see in the parenthetical, we talked about this. Our section 1144 was initially acted by what public law? 93-406, everybody see that? And then it was initially amended by what public law? Remember what punctuation symbol we're looking for and amended by? Semicolon. So what's the next public law that amended, first amended 93-406? Excellent, 97-473. So here are all the different public laws that amended our initial enactment. So when you're doing legislative history research, do you want to you may be, rephrase that. So when you're doing legislative history research, you probably want to start with the law that initially enacted it, because that's going to have the purpose of the law, as we saw, as well as detail for lots of the language. But of course, that was in 1974, and as we see by all of these public laws, there are probably at least a dozen of them, if not more, that amended 93-406. The law changed over time. How do we know that our language wasn't language that got changed or even added later on? And that, the answer to that is what Joe mentioned earlier, the historical and statutory notes, or really specifically the amendments section within the historical and statutory notes. So on page 29, let's take a closer look. So the historical and statutory notes tells us a whole lot of stuff, not all of which are really useful. So it starts out by giving us revision notes and legislative reports. So it's referring us to various congressional reports issued by these various issues when these various public laws were considered. So 1974 we see it, 1983. I'm not sure, honestly, how useful any of that is. Certainly not for legislative intent research. So you can see the various acts listed. And we'll look at how to get to that on Westlaw in just a second. Then we see references in text. And this, I'm guessing, may be, Joe, what you were seeing, references to different public laws. These are basically references to other sections of the code and their public laws. Again, I'm not sure how useful this really is with regard to legislative intent research. There may be other uses for it. So, for instance, it refers to the Social Security Act. That's relevant for ERISA, but it's not relevant for our legislative intent research. What is relevant is the amendments. And you'll see that on page 30 in the right-hand column toward the top. What the amendments section tells us is for each amendment, so for each public law that amends our original one, it's going to tell us a little bit about how that public law changed the law. So it starts in reverse chronological order. So up in 2006, we see that Public Law 109-280 added subsection E. So in 2006, subsection E was added. So if our language, what we were interested with subsection E, I might not even want to look at 93-406. I would want to look at 109-280 and the legislative history behind it and all the documents we just talked about for 109-280 because I'm interested in subsection E, and that's when that was added. So this helps us so we don't have to look through the dozen plus public laws, maybe. No. So you can see for the next amendment, the next recent amendment, 1998 amendments, so subsection B, so there was no change in the text. So that tells me, okay, no change in 1998, I might not have to look at that one. Public Law 105-200, and struck out, enforced by, inserted, they apply to. So if I care about that, hooray, I know which public law to look at. Probably I don't care about that because that's not a huge change. And you just go through, and it can be a little time-consuming to read through all of this, but a whole lot better than doing legislative history, the full legislative history research for a dozen plus public laws. You can narrow it down to one or two. That's a good thing, and it's worth 15 or 20 minutes of reading these amendments notes. In my opinion, if you want to do legislative history research for all of those, have fun. Okay, and of course, if we are in print, we have to remember to update, because you want to make sure there weren't new public laws that amended our section. So in our pocket part, we already know that because we've seen this before, that there were no new public laws since the last one listed in the main volume. So we're set. But you always want to make sure. So here on Westlaw, so we see our credits, so we see all our public laws that amended. We want to find those historical and statutory notes, and specifically we want to find the amendments within the historical and statutory notes. So not surprisingly, that would come under history. We're talking about legislative history after all, right? And we want to go to editors and revisers notes. I don't know why they call it this on Westlaw. but they do. And you just have to remember, and I can't think of a good way to help you remember other than go to history and go to notes.
How did you get that menu to pop up with the editors and
I clicked on the history tab.
Okay, thank you.
Everybody with me? Click on history tab, editors and revisers notes. We'll talk about what this legislative history materials is in a minute. But you want to look at the editors and revisers notes, again, to look at that amendment section. And I'm going to just scroll down to it. So we see those revision notes, again, that refer us to reports, and the references in text to talk about other code section. And here are the amendments. And what we see is exactly what we saw in the book. So we see that the 2006 amendments, subsection E, added subsection E, same exact text. We see down here, I'm going to skip ahead because we haven't talked about this one yet. So Public Law 10366, substituted provisions directly, that's subsection A, not to be construed. So if I'm interested in subsection A, I'll want to read that in more depth. So again, these amendments within the editors and revisers notes, historical and statutory, also known as historical and statutory notes, that will help you determine which public laws you need to look at when you do legislative intent research. So helping you find that all-important public law number. And not every section is going to be this complex. Any question about finding all-important public law numbers? Looking at our handout on page 4, our Key to Legislative History handout. So that's Roman numeral 3 of our Key to Understanding. So we've done 1, legislative process. We've done 2, documents and abbreviations. We're looking at number 3, all-important public law number. So the parenthetical at the end of the code, if you're in print, the credits or history on Westlaw or Lexis, and look at the amendment section. If for whatever reason you're not starting with a code section, 1144 like we are, you're starting with a popular name, remember the popular name table. That will get you that all-important public law number. And again, if you have a reference to a popular name, like remember we were looking at Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and you need to know what section the code is, because that was in 1965 or 6, I forget the year already. That was a long time ago, but they're talking about the Section 5 as it exists today. So we first have to translate it to the code, and then we can look at the parenthetical in the code. So you might want to use our Table 3 translation table to get the public law number from the popular name table, Voting Rights Act, get the public law number, and then translate it to the code. We're getting in kind of complex here, and I'm not going to ask you to do that. But for anybody who's interested, that would be the process. Okay, most importantly, getting that all-important public law number again. Credits on Westlaw, and then go to the historical and statutory notes. Under the history tab, well, the editors and revisers notes, and from there go to the historical statutory notes amendments in print, the historical and statutory notes and the amendments, and then briefly on Lexis. Ooh, it pulled it up. Lexis actually, I think, makes it sort of easier for us. We just go to history, and we have the public laws, and then scrolling down just below that, we'll find those amendment notes. Now, Lexis lists them in chronological order instead of reverse chronological order. I don't know why. But you find information about what each public law did. Any questions about finding that all-important public law number? Okay, so we're 3/4 the way there. Let's take a break and come back and dive into the actual legislative intent research. So meet you back here at 5:20. Okay. So by way of review, we didn't go through back on our walkthrough handout. just to point out, taking a look at page 33, I've given you essentially a screenshot of how to find the all-important public law number with a review of what the different public laws are, what the numbers are. So on page 33, we see on Westlaw, again, the credits. So the enacting public law number, always the first one. And I point out, and I wanted to make this clear as you're doing the section on statutes, I point out on page 33 the last amending public law number, not because it has any intrinsic importance. Certainly the first one does, because that enacted the whole statute and has probably much of the language that you'll be interested in, even though it could get changed over time. The last amending public law number is pointing out to you is just a way to point out how to read that whole parenthetical credits history section. So don't think you always have to look for the last amending section. Again, that's just a way to help you understand how to read all of this. That first one is typically very important. Okay, so looking on page 34, again, just to review, and this is also, you obviously will take this home with you, so a way of helping refresh your memory, how to find all this information online. So again, on Westlaw, screenshot of page 34, the sort of upper half is using the history menu to find the editors and revisers notes, and the bottom section, again, scroll down to the amendments, what we already talked about and I demonstrated. And again, how to do it on Lexis, going to the history menu and then looking at the public law number and scrolling down to the amendments, which we just did a quarter of an hour ago. Okay, so let's do the deed and take a look at how we do some legislative intent research now that we have an understanding of the process, what the documents are produced, how to find that all-important public law number. And what we want to take a look at are some really useful sources to do this. Now, you may have access to some of these wherever you wind up working and not others. You're always welcome to come back to Hofstra to use these resources, or you may find others wherever you are that are a bit different. So, for my money, for what the resources we have here, where I would start is actually what we see on page 36, and it would be on Hein Online. Hein Online, as we're discovering, has a whole lot more than just law journals. Not to say having law journals isn't a great thing in PDF, but it's got other material as well. I guess it's the, I don't know, do they still do the, but wait, there's more on late night commercial TV. I haven't stayed up late enough in a long time to see it. So I don't know if they do that anymore, but they used to. But wait, there's more. So Hein Online is kind of like that. So we have our law journal library. We saw the U.S. Code. And what we have, and the more that we've been waiting for, is down here we have a U.S. Federal Legislative History Library. And what that does, and you can see on the walkthrough on pages 36 and 37, 36 and 37, at least 36. Yeah, 37. If you click on that, and then you'll see the title collection. And it's going to make me log in again, not surprisingly. So again, authenticating with my name and my 700 number. Oh, good, let me in. So the Federal Legislative History Title Collection on Hein Online. Now the bad thing about Hein Online is that it doesn't have every single public law. So you may not find your public law in this, and if you don't, then obviously you can't use it. But if you do, so it will let you do some keyword searching. I'll show you why that's so helpful in a minute. So you can look by title, you could guess by popular name, but of course, since we have the all-important public law number, to me that's the easiest way to go. And so if we're looking for ERISA, we know it's 93406. So I just find the Congress number. I know what the public law number means. And then I can scroll down or just use Control F and get down to 406, and sure enough, there's ERISA. And it actually gives me two choices. I could look at the 22-volume legislative history, or I could look at the 3-volume. And by legislative history, what I mean is a compiled legislative history. What I'm looking at in Hein Online is some people, actually frequently librarians, got together and pulled together all of the documents in that whole process from bill through public law, pulled together all of those different documents from all of the different committees, because typically more than one committee looks at a bill, and pulled them all together and put them in one place. So we have a 22-volume version of compiled legislative history for ERISA, or a 3-volume. I'm going to look at the 22 because I want to be as complete as I can. And it's this search box is the reason why I prefer Hein Online as my first stop for legislative intent research. So I'm now looking at a set, or 22 volumes. You can see basically the volumes are numbered, not very informative. But I can now search for whatever language it is I'm interested in finding a legislative intent for. So maybe it's just preemption. Now remember, on Hein Online, the search engine isn't very sophisticated, so I can't use /s or /p. I might want to try preemption. I might want to look at the help to see if there's a truncation, so I just have preempt. So you want to keep it pretty basic, but you can use more than one word. I'd usually use a word or a phrase. And what Hein Online does for me is it does a full text search of all of 22 volumes of documents of legislative history. Obviously, I don't want to be looking through 22 volumes page by page. That would take forever. It also, even just compiling those documents in the first place. So what Hein Online does is it tells me the different places where my term is found. Now, where are the places that I want to look first for legislative intent? What kind of documents? And? Excellent. I don't see them here, though. I see hearings. I see prints. Remember the show more. I don't know why they hide the reports under there, but they do. And so there are 3 House reports, and there's 1 Senate report that has my term. So I could tell Hein Online to go with those. And you can see the reports. Actually, it looks like so here are the different reports that have the term that I searched for, and I can now go look at those pages and see what Congress had to say. Did they include it in that detailed section by section analysis? Actually, probably what I would do is take a look at those reports, look at the pages where my term is, and then go look at the section by section analysis to see if they said anything about my section. Because I know in Public Law 93-406, I'm interested in section 514. So I would take the knowledge, I would do some keyword searching, and then take the knowledge that I have about legislative history and do some further research to see if they said anything of interest to my section, of my section, even if it didn't use the word preemption. Just remember, actually, our section doesn't use that word, right? Interestingly enough. So that would be my first step. You'll notice, actually, it does include conference reports. Now, if Hein Online didn't have my public law number, and I could do a keyword search, then my next step would be one of 2 places. It depends on how in-depth I need to be. It could be that you don't have to do what I call a boil the ocean legislative intent research. That is, look at everything you can possibly look at, so look at all 22 volumes. It could be I just need to get a sense of what's going on, and that I can actually do for free. And this is another thing we're talking about throughout the course is, what if I don't have access to these way cool, expensive databases? Congress.gov, it's not great, certainly not compared if we find something on Hein Online, but you can find a little bit. And again, this is just Congress.gov. Again, because we have our all-important public law number, I'm going to click on public laws. And now, because it's on the web and because it's for free, as is typical, I imagine many of you have found on the web, the further back you go in time, the less you find. And that's going to be true for Congress.gov as well. So let's find 406. So it's giving us reference to the reports, but no links, again, because it's kind of old. By way of another example, actually that didn't bring me, let's go back in the beginning, just to give you an example of what it might look like with something that has a little bit more. I'm going to go to the 109th Congress. And then I'm going to go to number, and this is just a random number, again, just to show you what it looks like when there is. So it's the Electronic Duck Stamp Act. We were talking about ducks couple of classes ago, and it's a funny name. But here, and more importantly, you can see what Congress.gov looks like. It does have a couple of links, so you can actually look at these reports. And as we saw when we looked at Congress.gov last time, we can see the process. So the legislative process under the Actions tab, with links to whatever else, so congressional record links, and again, congressional record equals what? Congress debates. So that's Congress.gov. It is free. Not a lot there, but it's better than nothing. Another place I might go, again, this used to be my all-time favorite. I would extol the virtues of ProQuest Congressional, the next database we're going to look at, for about 5 minutes before I would go into it. It's not, sadly, not as good anymore, and that's unfortunately what happens with resources over time. Some get a whole lot better, like Hein Online used to not have anything. Now it's my first place to go. So ProQuest Congressional is no longer my favorite place. Some of you may wind up, especially if you're in larger institutions that do a lot of this, you might have a database called ProQuest Legislative Insight. We don't have that here because it costs literally tens of thousands of dollars. But we do have ProQuest Congressional, which is still pretty good. And so here on ProQuest Congressional, and by the way, I also have screenshots of what we're doing on Hein Online through pages 38 and Congress.gov on page 39 and 40, and it's pretty much what we just did. And now on page 42, we're looking at ProQuest. So in ProQuest, I'm going to look at the legislative histories because that's what we're interested in. And I am going to go to the law library account. And again, this is a database also pretty expensive. You're welcome to come use once you graduate. Come back to the library. So again, I would want my all-important public law number. And let's take a look at ERISA. And I've got legislative histories checked there on the side. And of course, we want ERISA, not the Grand Canyon Park Enlargement Act. And what ProQuest Congressional does for us is it gathers the citations. And depending on how recent it is, it will also give us links. So again, the older it is, you may or may not get links. Newer public laws, you'll be more likely to get links, and you'll see the different types of documents that we've been talking about here on the side, so you can jump directly down to a document or just scroll and take a look. So one thing ProQuest didn't do for older public laws, but does for newer ones, so this would be an older one, it doesn't give us specific congressional record page sites, so we would have to look at the Daily Digest either in the bound volume or the daily edition for June 27th, 1973, or February 26th to 28th, 1974. So there's an example where that Daily Digest would be particularly useful. So you have to look through the whole thing. You could from Daily Digest and see where they talked about ERISA for those dates. But of course, we're mostly interested in reports if we're doing legislative intent research. So you can see ProQuest gives us references to those as well as links. One trick in using ProQuest, again, one reason I don't like ProQuest as much as I used to, is you want to look at the reports. You also want to find to see if there are any conference reports, which we already know there are for 93-406. The best, they don't tell you which is the conference report or if there are any conference reports. The best way I know of is to look for the word conference, then good old Control F, and I see a reference to a conference report. If I see a reference to a conference report for a public law number, I know there's probably a conference report. If I don't find one anywhere in the legislative history under ProQuest, then there probably wasn't a conference report. So once I know there's a conference report, I go to the reports section, and because I know a conference report happens at the end of the process typically, I scroll to the end, and I basically just take a look at the last couple of reports. I might note the date of the conference report, or I might just take a look at it. And so that very last report is the one I just clicked on. And scrolling down and looking at its description, sure enough, it's a conference report. Why they couldn't put that on the first screen where they list all the reports, I don't know. I wish they would. I have complained to them, and they have said, too bad. Seriously. But so, it's a little clunky, I know. But if you're using ProQuest and you want to see if there's a conference report, and you want to make sure you look at it, that's the best way I have figured out. Any questions? So you can see a quick review of ProQuest on pages 42 through 44. So last place you might want to look for legislative history, legislative intent research, is actually print. And we've been talking about this publication for a little while now, and that's United States Code Congressional and Administrative News, fondly known as USCAN. And the reason why I even mention USCAN, because with all the, especially with Congress.gov available to everybody online, the only reason you might want to use USCAN is if you see a reference to it. You might see a reference in a law review. You might see a reference in a brief to it. And the reason for that is USCAN actually does more than just publish public laws. So when we talked about public laws, we took a look at statutes at large, the official source for public laws, and we talked about USCAN, the unofficial source. And I passed around Volume 1, and Volume 1 says laws, and we turn to 93-406, which happens to have no longer has a little bit of a tab left. That one's deteriorating rapidly. And we saw our public law. And turning on page 46, you see the very same thing on title page, volume 1. It's labeled laws. And turning on page 47, we see ERISA. Except we also notice on top, underlined for legislative history of acts, see page 4639. I'll pass this around in a moment because I want to do some compare and contrast. So it turns out page 4639 is in volume 3 of USCAN for 1974. Let me back up a second, turning to page 48. See, I put it in there so I would not forget this, and it's a good thing I did. Because we skipped over this when we talked about statutes and public law. A good source for the legislative history, I should say a good source for legislative intent sometimes is the public law itself. Because looking at Public Law 93-406, Section 2, the very second section, is findings and declaration of policy. So in the public law itself, now this doesn't always happen, but it's worth a quick look, right, in the very beginning of the public law to see if they say what they intended to do with all this. So maybe if they're talking about providing health benefits and so forth, maybe there's an argument to be made, hey, this is what Congress wanted to do. Not sure how well we would do with that argument, honestly, for our client, but good to always take a look and see if Congress actually said in the very public law what its intent was. Okay, so getting back to UScan. So that's all in Volume 1 in the Laws volume that we've looked at now a couple of times. So in Volume 3 is that page reference we got. I think it's 4639, if I remember. So that turns out to be Volume 3 of 1974 of UScan. And turning to page 4639, as you'll see on page 50 of the walkthrough handout, what UScan does is list for us some of the legislative history documents, mostly the reports, because of course the reports are the important source for legislative history, legislative intent research. And then it lets us know, actually in UScan, we're going to set out one of them. So you don't even have to go find this, we're giving it to you in UScan. And a lot of times I see UScan cited as a source for a report. You'll either see it abbreviated as UScan, or sometimes you see it abbreviated US Code Cong Admin. You see funky shortening of the words. But that all winds up being UScan. And what you'll see on Volume 3 of UScan, it's no longer labeled laws on the bottom, it's labeled legislative history. So you can find the legislative history portion of UScan two ways. You either get the page reference, like we did from our public law, or you find the legislative history volume, and then it's even the legislative history sections are organized numerically by public law number. So we turn to 93406, and just before 93406, you'd see the legislative history for 93402, because I guess they don't have anything for 403, 404, or 405. And after 406, 406 is kind of long, looks like we see 410. And again, I point out UScan, not because that's going to be your first choice or even second or maybe even third choice of where you're going to go, but you will see a reference to it. It's good to understand what you're looking at. Let's see if I'll let you do the weightlifting start around. And just really, when I'm passing it around, take a look at the spine so you can see the difference between the laws volume and volume 1 and the legislative history volume and volume 3. And that's really the main significance of that. Okay. Now, I don't know if any of you are thinking, what about Lexis and Westlaw? Can't they help out? I know Lexis and Westlaw, this whole ProQuest thing and even Congress.gov, I gotta learn a whole new system then. Why can't I just use Lexis and Westlaw? And the answer is, Westlaw isn't bad, Lexis is a pain. So you can use Westlaw. It's not as good as Hein because it doesn't let you do full text searching, which is, again, why I prefer Hein. And I should also mention ProQuest doesn't let you do full text searching either. You can get to the documents, and you can look at each document and do Control-F, but you can't search the documents overall the way we did on Hein. So Hein's really the only place as of today, and maybe ProQuest will hear me somehow and change that. I hope so, but don't hold your breath. And maybe Westlaw, actually, better still. So let's take a quick look, though, at Westlaw and what they do have so far, and maybe change someday. So back here in our section, 291144, I promised you I would get back to. And so we had already looked at the editors and revisers notes to look at the amendments section so we could see what public law we might need to look at for the legislative history documents. But it turns out Westlaw does have some of those legislative history documents under legislative history materials. Actually, at least this name is kind of intuitive. So again, under the history tab, legislative history materials, I find it a little confusing. Maybe you don't, but I'm just going to give you fair warning of at least one area I get confused, is how they list the public laws. So they list them in reverse chronological order. So they list the legislative materials for the most recent public law first. Okay, so that's not too confusing. So here's 109-280. We have something called joint committee prints. Joint committee prints are of interest to people who are interested in tax, because the joint committee is actually Joint Committee on Taxation. So all this joint committee stuff is tax stuff. Then there's our good friend congressional record, and we find what in the congressional record? Congressional record equals Congress debates. Excellent. So we scroll. So here's the congressional record for Public Law 109-280. Now here is testimony. Don't get debates confused with testimony. I know it sounds the same, and I don't know why Westlaw names it this way. Testimony is actually hearings on Westlaw. So you click on these links will be links to hearings. These are not links to the congressional record or the debates, which is the same thing. Those links will be under congressional record. Okay, so that's one area of confusion on Westlaw. And then Westlaw actually gives us links to those presidential messages if we're interested. And the other tricky part to me on Westlaw is actually seeing where the next public law starts. So we were looking at the legislative history materials for Public Law 109-280. Then just right here in actually kind of smallish font, in my opinion, we start the legislative history materials for Public Law 105-200. And so it starts with the reports, and we have some links. And again, the congressional records equals debates. We have some links. Scrolling past congressional records equals debates. Then we have one link for testimony, and testimony is what on Westlaw? Hearings. Testimony on Westlaw equals hearings. I have all sorts of formulas. You think I was a math person. And then presidential messages. And then again, kind of difficult to see, in my opinion. We start with the legislative history materials for Public Law 104-204. And again, the reports and all the other materials. So you have some materials on Westlaw. It's not too bad to get to. You have to read it carefully. You have to understand that testimony is not the same as debates. Testimony is hearings. Congressional records equals debates. But it's there. And again, you can't search the legislative history materials. Like I couldn't do a search up here and just search all of these materials or all of the materials for one public law. I'd have to click in and then search from there. So that's a conference report for that public law. And I could do a Control F to search my terms at that point. Excuse me. So that's legislative history on Westlaw. On Lexis, basically from the section itself, not really anything. The only way to get legislative history on Lexis is not going to be section specific. And honestly, I'm not sure how useful this is. So I'm going to do a keyword search, HMO liability. I've narrowed to statutes and legislation. Run my search. And remember, when we do a statutes and legislation search on Lexis, Lexis gives us more than just the code. When we've been talking about statutes and codes, we want to look at the code, the law, statute as they exist today. But what Lexis gives us is codes and a bunch of other stuff. Some of this other stuff is actually bill text or legislative histories. So if we click on this legislative histories, I can see entries for my keywords, but I don't necessarily know what public law these apply to. I don't find this useful. Maybe you will, but that's what Lexis has to date. Now there are ways. What I would suggest you do, there are ways of narrowing down to a public law. It involves a fairly intricate search. If you are in a Lexis institution and you need to do that, call Lexis. And likewise, Westlaw, if you're confused about any research, really, not just legislative history, but remember that resource. I've thrown an absolute ton out you, probably too much for one class. So I don't want to add to it with Lexis. So the point is giving you resources to figure it out when you need it. And if you are in a Lexis institution, that's my best advice, is figure it out when you need it and call Lexis and say, how do I find the legislative history for Public Law 109-280? And let them walk you through it. Okay. I'm going to take a quick look at Bloomberg. And actually, this might also help some of you. Bloomberg doesn't really organize by jurisdiction, so you want to look at legislative and regulatory. So here we do have the U.S. Code. You could look at state legislative materials if we're talking about statutes. For legislative history, again, not very much. Honestly, if I need to do legislative history research, I'd go to congress.gov before I would go to Bloomberg or Lexis for that matter, although I might call Lexis for help if I really need to do more in depth. Okay, last thing I want to go over quickly, because we've spent most of the class, the very large majority of the class, talking about the first reason we do legislative history research, which is legislative intent. There's that second reason, bill tracking. We don't know what's happening with the bill that's currently before Congress. And in my opinion, again, the best place for that is actually congress.gov. If you have a bill number, or you could do keyword search. So let's go back to the home page. And again, if you have a bill number, you can put it here. If you have keywords, you can put it here. I'm just going to show you what a bill tracking looks like by looking at some of the most viewed bills. So in this Congress, 115th Congress, so within the last not quite 2 months, we have all these bills introduced. So HR, remember HR is a bill, not House reports. So HR 861. So there have been at least 861 bills introduced to Congress in a month and a half. And so here's HR 61 to terminate the Environmental Protection Agency, and it tells us the sponsor and what committees it got referred to, its last action, got referred to the House Science, Space, and Technology, and it gives you this nice little tracker to tell you where it is in the process. If you want a little more detail, we can look at that Actions tab. And this is just the overview, so I want to go to all actions. And it tells me the different committees it got referred to. ProQuest has its bill tracking. Lexis and Westlaw have its bill tracking. Just by way of quick example, because I do want to get to our workshop. Lexis is kind of neat. They have this new feature. I haven't quite decided if I think it's useful or not. So we go to pending legislation. So again, here's a bill introduced in our current Congress. And it gives us this likelihood of passage meter. So not very likely this particular bill. I don't even know what it is. And this is the bill report. I could go to the bill tracking, which kind of looks the same. If this legislative outlook, this is actually a new initiative by Lexis. Again, I haven't looked at it much, but it's kind of pretty anyway. It gives a synopsis. We can look and see what the legislative outlook in detail. It gives you all these funky percentages. And Westlaw bill tracking, kind of similar. Actually, let's just go back. And you can find current bills on both Lexis and Westlaw. Again, I go to congress.gov. I think it's easier. You all like to do things the easier way. It's just as informative. So again, let's take a look at this particular bill. And so this is actually the text of the bill, and I can take a look at the tracking tab. And this is what bill tracking, not quite as pretty as Lexis. Little meters and charts and all. But again, the concept of bill tracking is what's important, and that is to see what the status is of a bill currently before a legislature. Any questions? Okay, like I said, I know I've thrown a whole lot at you. So let's see if we can apply it, because hopefully it will start to make some more sense that way. So I'm going to pass around the workshop. And as it goes around, so I'm asking everybody to start with a particular U.S. Code section and to fill in the chart on the other side of the page. And on the other side of the page, you'll see a chart with ProQuest, Congressional, Westlaw, and Congress.gov. And that's across the top. Going down the side, I'm asking you to find bill, hearings, committee reports, prints or documents, conference reports, congressional record, and weekly daily compilation of presidential documents. Now bear in mind, you will not find every single document in every single resource. Some resources are going to be more complete than others, so you'll find more in probably ProQuest Congressional than you will in Congress.gov. You might not find, for instance, prints or documents in any of them because, as I mentioned, those are less common documents to get produced. So it's okay if you say none, because that could be the answer. Conference reports, remember, are different than committee reports. Conference, remember, is when the House and Senate get together. When you get to conference reports, ask for help on ProQuest, because it's just hard to find on ProQuest. That's one reason I asked Isaac here, so he can help out with the questions. So I ask you to and fill in the information on the top row, and in the top row, basically I'm giving you the section number, 12 U.S.C. 481. Find the all-important public law number for the most recent amendment. That's the one that's the public law number we're going to use for this exercise, and see if you can find the popular name, and then fill in the rest of the chart. If there's more than one of any document type, just list the most recent one that seems most relevant, and again, don't spend time on relevance. The point of this is just to understand how to get to legislative history documents. I'm going to ask you to look at one of the committee reports that is not the conference report, and this is question number 3 that you found on ProQuest, and find the section-by-section analysis. Again, because that's the important legislative intent portion of the report. And I'm just asking you what page does that start on, and describe in a very short sentence, a few words is fine, the purpose of one of the sections. And then I'll ask you to go to Hein Online, pull up the all-important public law number, take a look at a House or Senate report, and again, remember to use the show more links, and give do a search for students and give a report citation and a page number. So report citation, remember, is the report number. So 109-533 was an example of a report number that we looked at, and whatever page number that you find the word students on. Sounds like a lot. We'll go through it step by step, and Isaac and I will be wandering around, so don't hesitate if you have any questions. We won't have wasted Isaac's time spending all this time hanging around.
It's always good to hear more.
Well, very kind of you to say. Okie dokie. I'm good.